It was an ordinary day. The sun shone brightly over the bustling city, casting long shadows on the streets below. People hurried to work, children played in the parks, and life carried on as usual. Yet, for those who had heard the whispers of prophecy, something felt different, like a silent weight pressing against the soul. Sarah, a devoted mother of two, sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee while reading her Bible. The words on the page seemed to leap out at her. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven, with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God. A chill ran down her spine, but she quickly shook it off. Glancing at the clock, it was time to pick up the kids from school. Outside, the skies were a deep azure, but in an instant, the world changed. A deafening sound echoed through the air, the blast of a trumpet, louder than anything Sarah had ever heard. She rushed outside, her heart racing, only to see people frozen in shock, staring upwards. The sky split open, revealing a radiant light that engulfed the heavens. In the brilliance, figures began to ascend, people vanishing before her eyes. Their bodies lifted off the ground as though gravity had lost its grip. Cries filled the streets, a mixture of awe, confusion, and terror. Sarah dropped to her knees. This was it, the rapture. Tears streamed down her face as she realized her heart wasn't ready. She had heard sermons about this moment, but the distractions of life had pulled her away from the urgency. Now she watched as others were taken into the sky, clothed in shimmering white, while she remained grounded, paralyzed with regret. Suddenly, her thoughts turned to her children. Were they safe? Would they be taken? She sprinted toward the school, her legs trembling. But as she reached the gates, a scene unfolded that shattered her heart. A group of children, ascending, their faces filled with peace. While parents screamed in desperation below, her children too were among them, rising into the sky, their hands outstretched toward heaven. "No! God, please!" Sarah wailed, falling to the ground. Her heart shattered, guilt ripping through her like a storm. She had always meant to go deeper, to live fully for Christ. She had believed, but hadn't truly surrendered. All around her, chaos ensued. People clawed at the sky, screaming for a chance they knew would never come. It was too late. The grace that had always been offered so freely was now gone, taken with the ones who had lived faithfully for Jesus. The earth, once filled with life, felt cold and empty. As the light in the sky began to fade, a voice, gentle yet firm, whispered in Sarah's ear. "I am coming soon. Be ready." But the time had passed. The final call had been made. Sarah sobbed, her heart heavy with the weight of all she had lost, knowing she had one last choice: to live for him in the time that remained, or continue in despair. The days that followed the rapture were bleak. The once vibrant city was now a haunting shadow of its former self. Buildings stood deserted, and the laughter of children was replaced by an eerie silence. The absence of the faithful left a palpable void, and fears swept over the streets like a thick fog. Among the remnants of the city, Sarah wandered aimlessly, her heart aching for her children, and the life she had taken for granted. But as she moved through the streets, she realized she was not alone. Many, who had been left behind, were grappling with despair, confusion, and anger. News reports flooded the airwaves, featuring ominous broadcasts about the new regime rising to power. A shadowy figure, the Antichrist, emerged, a charismatic leader who promised peace and order in the chaos. His followers grew rapidly, drawn in by false promises and the allure of security. Those without the mark of the beast faced persecution, denied access to food and resources. In the heart of the city, Sarah witnessed the desperation of the people. Crowds gathered at food distribution centers, only to find that the lines were reserved for those who had accepted the mark. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and malnourished faces told stories of pain and loss. As people turned to one another for solace, whispers of rebellion began to surface. One fateful afternoon, Sarah found herself in the midst of a crowd as they protested against the oppressive regime. But their cries for justice were met with violence. Soldiers and futuristic robots patrolled the streets, enforcing the will of the Antichrist with an iron fist. As the crowd grew restless, Sarah felt a surge of courage. She would not let fear silence her. As soldiers began to disperse the crowd, a young girl, terrified and alone, stumbled into Sarah's path. Without thinking, Sarah took the girl's hand, and they joined the throng of people, rushing to escape the approaching soldiers. "Stay close to me," Sarah urged, her heart racing as they dashed through narrow alleyways. The clanging of metal echoed behind them, and the mechanical whir of robots filled the air as they pursued those without the mark. The group stumbled into a hidden courtyard, overgrown with weeds, small sanctuary amidst the chaos. But their relief was short-lived as the sound of footsteps drew nearer. The ominous figures of soldiers and robots loomed at the entrance, scanning the area with cold precision. "We can't stay here," someone shouted, and Sarah nodded, her mind racing. They had to climb over the crumbling wall at the back of the courtyard to escape. One by one, they helped each other up, their hearts pounding with fear and determination. Just as the last person climbed over, the soldiers broke through the entrance. "You cannot escape," a soldier shouted, but Sarah had already made it to the other side, leading the girl away into the dense forest. The path through the trees was fraught with danger, but the fading light above them gave her hope. As they ran deeper into the forest, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had lost everything, but she had also gained a mission to share the message of Christ's love and the urgency of being prepared for his return. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah found refuge among a small group of believers who had also escaped the chaos. They gathered in secret, sharing stories of hope and faith, praying for strength to endure the trials ahead. They spoke of the Antichrist and the mark, warning others of the deception that had gripped the world. As they shared meals and encouragement, Sarah found solace in their camaraderie. Together, they began to spread the word, warning others of the fate that awaited them if they did not turn to Christ. In their hearts, they clung to the promise that he would come again, bringing justice and restoration. Despite the challenges they faced, Sarah's faith grew stronger each day. She learned to speak boldly about her experiences, urging those who would listen to surrender their lives to Christ before it was too late. And in the dark of night, as they gathered to pray, she felt the weight of her past slowly lifting. Replaced by a new sense of purpose, the world outside remained tumultuous, with the Antichrist tightening his grip on power. But within their hidden sanctuary, a flicker of hope burned brightly. Sarah knew that she had one last chance to live for him, to share his mercy and grace, and to prepare for the day when he would come again. As the season changed, and the world plunged deeper into chaos, Sarah and her group continued to share their message of hope. "You can pray this prayer with me. Lord Jesus, I come to you today, acknowledging that I am a sinner in need of your grace. I believe you died for my sins and rose again to give me new life. I ask you to forgive me, cleanse me, and make me whole. I surrender my heart and my life to you. Be my Lord and Savior. Help me to live for you from this day forward. Thank you for your love, mercy, and salvation. In Jesus' name, Amen."
When I'm lost,
The world was no longer the same. After the rapture, chaos gripped every corner of the earth. Governments fell, economies collapsed, and people wandered in confusion, trying to make sense of the unimaginable. Sarah was one of the millions left behind, but something within her had changed. The crushing realization that she had missed the rapture haunted her, yet she knew she still had a purpose. Her heart burned with a desire to make a difference, to help others, to survive, and most importantly, to live for Christ in a world that had forsaken him. In the days that followed, sickness spread like wildfire. Strange, inexplicable diseases ravaged the population, leaving bodies frail and helpless. Sarah found herself drawn to the suffering. She traveled from place to place, carrying what little supplies she had, caring for the sick and praying for them. Her hands worked tirelessly, bandaging wounds, feeding the hungry, and wiping away the tears of those in despair. She wasn't a doctor, but her prayers offered more comfort than any medicine could. Some recovered, while others succumbed to the plagues, but through it all, Sarah's faith remained unshaken. It wasn't long before whispers of even greater horrors reached Sarah's ears. People spoke of creatures, beasts from the sea, emerging from the depths and terrorizing the coastal towns. These weren't mere animals. They were monstrous, otherworldly. One night, while tending to a dying woman in a small Ghanaian village, Sarah heard a deep, guttural roar echoing from the shore. The villagers panicked, running into the forests to escape the unknown threat. Sarah grabbed her bag and followed them, her heart pounding with fear. As they fled into the forest, they heard the heavy footsteps of something large, something hunting them. The trees shook as the beast drew closer. Sarah led a small group of survivors, urging them to stay quiet and hide among the thick underbrush. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the erratic breathing of those huddled together. For hours they remained hidden, the creatures' roars reverberating through the trees. When morning came, they crept out, their bodies trembling but alive. That night marked the beginning of a new terror. The creatures from the sea began prowling the coastal cities, slaughtering anyone they found. Sarah continued to move, helping those she encountered. But everywhere she went, the fear of the beasts followed her. The sickness, the strange creatures, and the growing oppression from the Antichrist's forces left the world in tatters. Yet, Sarah remained determined. Her work was not without danger. One evening, while helping a group of survivors in the abandoned streets of Lagos, Sarah found herself face to face with one of the monstrous creatures. Its enormous body glistened with seawater, its glowing eyes locked onto her. Sarah froze, holding her breath as the beast sniffed the air, searching for its next victim. As it moved toward her, she whispered a prayer, gripping a makeshift spear in her trembling hands. Just as the creature lunged, an explosion in the distance distracted it, giving Sarah and her group a narrow window to escape. Despite the escalating horror, Sarah clung to her faith. She knew the world was crumbling around her, but she believed in the promises of Christ's return. There were moments when she wanted to give up, when the weight of the suffering was too much to bear. But she pressed on, fueled by the knowledge that she was called to be a light in the darkest of times. The days stretched into weeks, and the suffering deepened. Sarah, and the small group of survivors she had come to lead, continued their journey, moving from one place to another, always staying one step ahead of the beasts and the soldiers. The world was ruled by fear, and everywhere they went, they encountered the same horrific scenes: empty marketplaces, famine-ravaged towns, and the ever-looming presence of the Antichrist's army. His control over the world grew tighter with each passing day, and those who refused to take the mark of the beast were hunted relentlessly. One afternoon, Sarah stood at the edge of a small village in northern Nigeria, watching as soldiers, accompanied by towering robotic enforcers, patrolled the streets. The marketplace, once a bustling hub of activity, was now deserted. Food was scarce, and only those with the mark could buy or sell. Sarah's group, like many others, was forced to scavenge for food, but there was nothing left. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and the weakest among them began to succumb to the famine. One by one, people collapsed in the streets, too weak to move. Sarah tried to comfort them, offering her prayers and what little food they had left. But she could see the despair in their eyes. The digital billboards overhead displayed messages of compliance, urging people to take the mark and join the New World Order. Sarah clenched her fists, refusing to submit, knowing that to take the mark was to reject Christ forever. Desperation grew, and it wasn't long before the soldiers and robots began sweeping through the area, hunting down those who hadn't taken the mark. Sarah's group, like many others, was forced to scavenge for food, but there was nothing left. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and the weakest among them, began to succumb to the famine. One by one, people collapsed in the streets, too weak to move. Sarah tried to comfort them, offering her prayers and what little food they had left. But she could see the despair in their eyes. The world was on the brink of total destruction, but Sarah's faith remained unshaken, a beacon of light in the darkest of times. Sarah's face is filled with disbelief and anger, as she watches the world's elite prepare for their own survival, while millions suffer on the surface. Elijah whispers, they've known this was coming all along, and they're keeping it all for themselves. The team's tension grows as they realize they're dangerously close to being discovered, but they also now know the extent of the leader's betrayal. In the dimly lit depths of an underground bunker, the most powerful leaders of the world gathered around a sleek glass table. Holographic displays hovered above them, projecting images of a world in ruins. Rivers dried up, famine-stricken cities, and soldiers patrolling the broken streets. Their faces were hard, emotionless, as they discussed the next phase of their cold, calculated plan. As Sarah and her team slipped through the shadows, adrenaline surging, the weight of what they had overheard pressed heavily on their minds. The world's leaders, once trusted, Sarah's thoughts raced. Sarah had gone from a grief-stricken survivor to a reluctant leader, her heart torn between the crushing weight of responsibility and the faith that had begun to flicker back into her soul. The small underground community she now led consisted of believers, men, women, and children, who had refused to take the mark of the beast. They lived in constant fear of discovery, hiding in abandoned tunnels beneath the ruined city, moving only at night to scavenge for food. Each day was a battle for survival. The cities were no longer governed by familiar laws. Instead, the Antichrist's forces patrolled the streets, with soldiers and robotic enforcers hunting down anyone without the mark. Every trip to the surface was fraught with danger. Food was scarce, marketplaces were barren, and digital systems controlled everything, making even the simplest transaction impossible for those who refused the mark. Hunger gnawed at Sarah and her community, their bodies growing weaker, while diseases spread rapidly in their damp underground shelter. Yet, it was the internal battles that threatened to break her the most. The weight of protecting everyone was suffocating. Sarah had never asked to be a leader, but one by one, people turned to her, trusting her judgment, following her in their desperate attempts to survive. And then came the betrayals. One evening, a trusted member of their group, Jacob, disappeared. Sarah's heart sank, knowing the dangers outside, but her fears were confirmed the next day, when a patrol of soldiers entered the tunnels, as if they knew exactly where to look. In the panic, many were caught. The others barely escaped into the forest, scattering into the shadows. That night, as the survivors regrouped in a new hideout, it became clear. Jacob had traded their location for safety, a betrayal that cost many their lives. Sarah was devastated. She had believed in him, and now their family was broken. How could they trust anyone after this? The group's hope seemed to crumble like the ruined city around them. But just when Sarah felt she could no longer carry the burden, they met someone unexpected. A man named Elijah. Elijah appeared out of nowhere, stumbling upon their group while they were scavenging for food in the night. His knowledge of the city's underground passages and his deep faith gave them hope. At first, Sarah was cautious, unsure of his intentions, but soon he became invaluable to the group, guiding them through the most dangerous parts of the city, and leading them to untouched food supplies. His strength seemed supernatural, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if God had sent him to them for such a time as this. But as their situation worsened, supernatural forces began to stir. During one of their night journeys, strange, dark figures appeared on the streets, lurking in the shadows. These were not ordinary soldiers or even robots. They moved with an eerie speed, hunting without mercy, sensing the fear of those hiding from the Antichrist's mark. Elijah warned them that these were no mere men. They were spiritual forces, agents of darkness sent to wipe out any remaining faith. The group prayed more fervently than ever before, clinging to whatever faith remained. But the pressure mounted. Some in the group began to whisper doubts, wondering if it was better to take the mark and survive in the world, rather than face certain death. Despite the betrayal, the hunger, and the growing danger from supernatural forces, Sarah felt her faith deepen. Every day was a test, every moment a choice. She rallied the group, reminding them that their struggle was not just for survival, but for their souls. It was her hardest task, convincing people to keep the faith when everything around them screamed hopelessness. As their numbers dwindled and the threats grew stronger, Sarah knew they couldn't survive alone much longer. They had to find a way to fight back, to resist the powers closing in on them. Elijah spoke of other groups of believers, small pockets of resistance scattered throughout the land. If they could join forces, they might stand a chance, not just against human soldiers, but against the spiritual warfare they now faced. But every step forward was fraught with betrayal, hunger, and fear. And Sarah, once just a mother lost in grief, now found herself at the center of a war for the souls of men. Would they survive long enough to see Christ return, or would they be consumed by the forces of darkness closing in from all sides? In this world of chaos, Sarah's faith had become the beacon that kept them all moving, but she knew the true battle was only beginning. Every decision could cost lives, and every step could lead them closer to either redemption or destruction. She had to lead them. She had to keep the faith. The days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere around Sarah's group thickened with a mixture of fear and resolve. The threat of betrayal loomed large, but so did the glimmer of hope that their faith could inspire. They began to regroup, finding strength in prayer and unity, while Sarah leaned heavily on Elijah's wisdom. He spoke passionately of the power of the word, and how it had sustained the faithful throughout history. Under his guidance, they became more than just a survival group. They began to cultivate a community of hope, with the promise of other believer groups hidden across the land. Sarah felt an urgency to connect them. But the journey to find these hidden communities was fraught with peril. The Antichrist's forces tightened their grip, making it more dangerous to travel. Each expedition into the ruins of the city brought new horrors, dark creatures that slinked through the shadows, eyeing them hungrily, and soldiers who had turned merciless, searching for any sign of resistance. It was becoming clear that the true battle was both physical and spiritual. In their makeshift sanctuary, Sarah held nightly meetings, urging her community to remain steadfast. The air crackled with emotion as she reminded them of the scripture that had once brought her solace: "I can do all things through Christ, who strengthens me." As she spoke, she could see the flickers of determination in their eyes, as if they were slowly shedding their despair and embracing a fighting spirit. Then, one fateful night, their camp was ambushed. Sarah and Elijah had returned from a supply run to find their sanctuary surrounded by soldiers, their red eyes glowing ominously in the dark. The air was thick with tension, and panic swept through the group like wildfire. In the chaos, Sarah felt the crushing weight of responsibility more than ever. She quickly called for everyone to hide. But as she did, she caught sight of a familiar face among the soldiers. It was Jacob. The betrayal she had felt before came rushing back with a vengeance. He had been transformed, no longer the man she had once trusted. He wore the mark of the beast openly, and the malevolent smirk on his face sent a chill down her spine. He had sold his soul for power and safety, and now he stood on the other side of the line, actively hunting those he once called friends. In that moment, the lines between good and evil blurred. Sarah's heart raced as she faced the man she had once trusted. The soldiers began to search for the remaining members of her community, and she knew they had to act quickly. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped out of hiding, standing tall before Jacob. "Jacob," she called, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "What have you done? This isn't you." He turned, his expression a twisted blend of arrogance and pity. "You still don't get it, do you, Sarah? This is survival. Join us, and you can save them." His words dripped with a sinister allure, attempting to prey on her desperation. "No, I won't betray my faith," Sarah declared, her voice rising above the chaos. "I won't let fear dictate my choices. You may have taken the mark, but you can't take my soul." The tension escalated as their eyes locked, and Sarah felt a surge of righteous anger. She was no longer just fighting for her survival. She was fighting for the souls of those she loved. Behind her, she sensed Elijah and the others stirring, waiting for her cue. The moment hung heavy in the air, and then Sarah made her move. She turned to her community, rallying them with a fervor that surprised even her. "This is our moment. We fight not just against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of darkness. We stand united." With renewed strength, they fought back against the soldiers, not with weapons of violence, but with fervent prayer and unwavering faith. Elijah led the charge, speaking words of power and authority, casting out fear and doubt. Sarah joined him, her heart alight with purpose, as she called upon God's protection over her people. In the midst of the chaos, strange creatures emerged from the shadows, responding to the spiritual battle. These beasts, drawn to the turmoil, lunged at both soldiers and believers alike, creating further havoc.
Whoa, faith so strong, I hold tight. Whoa.
The nights were growing longer, darker. Every morning felt like a victory simply for waking up alive. But for Sarah, the weight of leadership had become suffocating. The underground bunker was no longer a refuge. It was a prison, filled with hungry faces and tired eyes that looked to her for hope. The whispers of doubt grew louder with each passing day, and even her own heart, once steadfast in faith, began to waver. One evening, as Sarah sat alone, clutching the Bible that had once brought her so much comfort, the words felt distant, almost foreign. "Where are you, God?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The suffering was relentless. Every day, someone fell ill. Another person disappeared on a desperate search for food, never to return. The weight of it all crushed her spirit. Among those closest to her, cracks began to show. Jacob, once her most loyal companion, had become distant, his eyes reflecting the emptiness he felt inside. "I don't know how much longer we can go on like this, Sarah," he admitted one night, his voice hollow. "How can we have faith when the world is nothing but death and suffering? Maybe we're wrong. Maybe we should have taken the mark." Sarah recoiled as if struck. The idea of giving in to the beast's mark was unthinkable. Yet she saw the desperation in Jacob's eyes. The same desperation she had been trying to ignore in herself. He wasn't alone. Others had begun to murmur about leaving the bunker, of giving up the fight and accepting the easier path. Some had already gone, their absence a haunting reminder of how fragile hope had become. Torn between her heart and her responsibility, Sarah faced the hardest decision of her life. Should she show compassion and let them go, or enforce a harsher, more rigid rule to keep everyone together, even if it meant losing their trust? Every night she prayed for strength, for answers, but the silence only deepened her despair. Then came the betrayal. One morning after another restless night, Sarah woke to find the bunker in chaos. Supplies had gone missing. Food, medicine, weapons. Panic spread through the small community as people searched for the culprit. Sarah's stomach dropped when Jacob's name was mentioned. She refused to believe it. Not him. Not her closest friend. But as she searched his sleeping area, her hands shaking, she found the missing items hidden away. A knife twisted in her heart. One morning, as Sarah stood at the entrance of the bunker, watching the dim light of a new day filter through the cracks, she heard a whispering voice behind her. It was Lena, a young woman, who had joined the group late. Her faith stronger than most. She had been one of the few who never seemed to waver, always praying, always encouraging others, even when despair threatened to swallow them whole. "There's something you need to see," Lena said, her voice hushed but urgent. Curiosity piqued. Sarah followed her through the narrow passageways of the bunker until they reached a small storage room where a group of the survivors had gathered. Lena pointed to a small handheld radio, something Sarah had long assumed was broken. Static buzzed faintly through the speakers, but then, amidst the noise, a voice came through. "Repeat. If you're hearing this, there's still hope." The underground bunker was filled with silence, the only sound being the distant hum of generators, keeping their last bit of civilization alive. Sarah stood in the corner, her mind racing. The group had grown weaker, food was scarce, hope was even scarcer. They had survived weeks of attacks from soldiers and strange creatures, but the worst was yet to come. The night was pitch black outside the hidden cave where they hid, and Sarah was pacing, her heart heavy with the weight of the world. She had always been strong, always known what to do. But now she felt the burden of leadership as every decision seemed to come with a price. She glanced over at the children under her care, their small faces twisted in fear and exhaustion. Among them was little Joel, a boy who reminded her of her own son, now long gone in the Rapture. She had promised to protect them, but deep down, she feared that promise was breaking. Suddenly, the stillness shattered. The ground shook, and the doors to the bunker burst open, soldiers swarming in, with a chilling efficiency. Their faces were cold, emotionless. Behind them, towering robots with glowing red eyes scanned the room, tracking every movement. Panic erupted, mothers screamed, men grabbed makeshift weapons, and Sarah rushed to shield the children. But it was too late. Within minutes, the soldiers had the upper hand. A deep, commanding voice cut through the chaos. A captain of the enemy forces. "We are here for you, Sarah," he said, stepping forward, his eyes gleaming with sinister intent. "You've caused too much trouble. But don't worry. We don't need to kill you today. You will come with us. Willingly." Sarah's blood ran cold as soldiers began rounding up the children. They screamed, crying out for her, their small hands reaching toward her as they were dragged into the dark. "No," Sarah shouted, trying to fight her way through the soldiers, but she was outnumbered. "Leave them alone." The captain smirked. "We will exchange the children's lives for yours. You come with us, or they die." He gave a small, almost casual nod, and soldiers began separating the children, dragging them further into the forest. The threat was real. A sudden movement caught Sarah's eye. It was Elijah. He had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for his moment. His face was filled with determination, his body poised for action. He wouldn't let them take the children. Without a second thought, Elijah launched himself into the fray, knocking two soldiers to the ground with a single fluid motion. Chaos exploded around them. Elijah fought with a fury Sarah had never seen before. He moved like lightning, but he was outnumbered. The soldiers were too many, and the robots too powerful. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. As she watched him fight, she wanted to scream, to help, but her feet were frozen in place. In the midst of the battle, a single shot rang out, cutting through the air with a deadly finality. Time slowed. Elijah staggered backward, clutching his chest, his hand coming away covered in blood. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He fell to his knees, his eyes meeting hers, full of pain, but also love. "No," she whispered, Running to him as the soldiers dragged the children away, she fell beside him, cradling his head in her lap, tears streaming down her face. No, 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 no. Her voice cracked, the world around her blurring into nothing but the weight of her grief. Elijah smiled weakly, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. I had to try. For you, for them. His voice was faint, the life slipping from his body. Sarah's heart shattered into a million pieces. She had fought beside him, trusted him. And now, in this moment, she realized just how much she loved him. With trembling hands, she leaned down, pressing her lips to his, in a soft, tender kiss. It was a kiss filled with all the unspoken words they had never shared, the emotions that had been buried under the weight of survival. I love you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Elijah's eyes softened, and for a moment, it seemed as if time stood still. Just the two of them in a world that was falling apart. He raised his hand, gently brushing her cheek with his fingers. Then, his hand fell limp, and the light left his eyes. As she stepped into the darkness, alone and heartbroken, she made a silent vow. No matter the cost, no matter the pain, she would protect those she loved, even if it meant laying down her own life. The world around her was spiraling into chaos, but Sarah would not surrender to despair. She would fight until her last breath.
Through the town, heaven is my home, I'll wear my crown. I will press on, I won't back down. Fight the fear, break the chains, in the sun and in the rains. Heaven is my home, no doubt remains. Fight the fear, break the chains. Raise my voice, I won't be alone.
As Sarah stood victorious on the battlefield, the eerie silence that followed sent a shiver down her spine. The sense of triumph was short-lived, for deep within her, she knew this wasn't the final battle. The Antichrist and his forces had merely retreated, regrouping for something far more sinister. She looked at her people, weary yet hopeful, their faces a reflection of her own heart, beaten but not broken. As Sarah and her people returned to the bunker, their spirits were lifted by the miraculous intervention they had just witnessed. As they gathered inside, Elijah's brother, Dylan, a brilliant but quiet engineer, stood before the group with a glint of hope in his eyes. I've been working on something, he began, his voice low, but filled with anticipation. Sarah looked at him, confused but intrigued. What is it, Dylan? He stepped forward, holding a small device in his hand. I've managed to hack into the control systems of some of the Antichrist's machines. We can control them. The room fell silent. For a moment, no one knew what to say. Could it be true? Had they just gained a weapon against the very machines that had terrorized them? Are you serious? Sarah asked, stepping closer. How is that possible? Dylan nodded, explaining how he had intercepted encrypted transmissions between the drones and their command center. After hours of risking detection and working tirelessly, he had finally broken through their defenses, gaining access to a segment of the robotic army. It's not perfect, he cautioned, but I can control a small group of them. Enough to turn them against their own forces. A wave of hope surged through the bunker. This was more than just survival now. It was a chance to strike back, but Sarah knew this wouldn't come without risk. Dylan, if they realize what you've done, they'll hunt me down. He finished her sentence, his eyes steady. But it's worth it. Sarah, we need every advantage we can get. The next day, the Antichrist's forces returned, their massive machines marching towards the rebel camp, intent on destruction. But this time, something was different. As the battle began, a section of the robots, once terrifying enemies, suddenly turned. They stopped in their tracks, their glowing red eyes dimming. Then, with a sudden jerk, they turned on the very forces that had commanded them, firing on the drones and soldiers that had brought so much destruction. But the victory was not without cost. Dylan, operating from a distance, was working feverishly to maintain control over the rogue robots. The strain was visible on his face as he fought to keep the signal strong, knowing that if he lost the connection, everything would collapse. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the battlefield. One of the machines had self-destructed, taking out a section of the enemy forces, but also severing Dylan's connection to the others. The hacked machines stuttered, their eyes flickering back to red as they reverted to their original programming. "No, no, no," Dylan shouted, frantically typing commands into his terminal. But it was too late. The remaining robots had returned to the control of the Antichrist's army, and they were coming back for vengeance. "We need to fall back," Sarah called out, recognizing the shift in the battle. But as they retreated, Dylan stayed behind, his fingers flying across the controls. "I can do this," he muttered to himself, sweat pouring down his face. In a final act of desperation, Dylan launched one last override command. The robots paused, their systems wavering, before exploding in a blaze of fire, taking out a massive portion of the Antichrist's forces. But Dylan paid the ultimate price for his bravery. As Sarah ran back to him, she found him lying on the ground, barely conscious.
Shadows stretch across my weary